Welcome, everybody, to today's sixth and final session in the series that we've been conducting of providing you with expert insights to help you lead through this COVID pandemic. While the pandemic is by no means over, as we well know, we are starting to emerge from the very initial stage of the crisis and into some new stages. And so that will require additional focus and leadership, but we wanted to provide these sessions for you all during the very initial stage of the crisis, and then we will continue to be here, as we'll talk about at the end, for all of the things that continue to unfold in 2020 and beyond. So for today, I want to introduce again my colleague, Sarah Matousek. She'll be joining me and interviewing me after I provide an overview of part two of how to make decisions amidst great uncertainty. So before I dive into that, let me just do a little bit of context setting. So if we go to the next slide. What we want to look at now as certain states are starting to reopen, albeit very carefully, and other states are poised to do so, including Massachusetts in the next few weeks. We wanted to start looking ahead to not just how you lead in the immediate crisis, but how you think about moving on this path to the next normal, which will be our new reality. So I wanted to look at it in kind of three stages. And the first is the stage we've been in, which is this reaction mode, where we've had to resolve a lot of issues and also put into place our own resolve to step up and lead during this crisis. And we've also had to figure out how to be resilient, with ourselves and with our organizations. So we've really been in this reaction mode, and that's not going to go away. But we know a lot more now than we did 6 weeks ago or 7 weeks ago. So where we are now is really in the next stage, which is the return, which is planning for how we're going to recover. We're going to focus mostly on healthcare organizations, but obviously this pandemic is affecting every single person and aspect of the economy, both here and abroad. So the plan for recovery is far-reaching, and there are many similar aspects across industries, but again, because our focus is on healthcare, we're going to stay there because there are some unique attributes to what's happening in the healthcare sphere. But I also want to spend some time talking about how we're going to reimagine our healthcare system, because as we pointed out before, we should never let a crisis go to waste. A crisis provides an opportunity for us to refocus and reprioritize with a speed with which we don't normally get to operate. And I'm typically a pretty cup half full kind of person and look at situations for their opportunities or silver linings, no matter how difficult they are. And there's a pretty major opportunity here for healthcare organizations to really reimagine their future. And I would say even for us and our society as a whole to reimagine how we think about the importance of healthcare and our interconnectedness and things like that. But I'll save that for another day in the future. What I want to stay focused on today is how you lead and help your healthcare organization plan for this return and reimagine. And of course, the context that we're in is one of tremendous uncertainty. So let me go to the next slide to put forward the framework we have been using throughout this series, which is how to lead in what we've been calling this landscape scale crisis. And to quickly recap, and I hope these are things that you're already doing, as a leader in a crisis, you've absolutely got to demonstrate empathy, and that's going to continue, for the foreseeable future. This is not something that's going to go away overnight. And even as we talk about reopening, we're also talking about being prepared for a resurgence of the virus, which could happen, this fall or into the winter, depending on how the reopening is handled and what happens with that. So empathy is going to be needed, as I say, into the foreseeable future, as well as communicating effectively. Never has communication been more important amongst your organization. And it's challenged by having to do it in some non-traditional ways, as we've all gotten used to the Zoom environment and such. That's going to continue. Organizing this network of teams, and that's a pretty fluid thing that will continue to evolve, but having the ability for rapid response and teams that can focus on the emerging information and identifying how to adjust into this next normal, that's a critical component. And elevating leaders, people who you may not have thought of as leaders in the past, thinking about who's got the right skills for this moment in time. And again, it's more than a moment. It's going to be something that we're contending with for the next year or two. So some folks have the attributes for leadership that are needed now, and you've got to be on the lookout for them and bring them forward. So that was the basic framework we've been using, but last week we started the huge topic of how to make decisions amidst uncertainty. And I talked about needing to be flexible and iterate, and I'm going to reiterate that. But I first want to bring you to another framework that will give you some tools to use when you are trying to think beyond the next few weeks and to how you move forward with your organization into the future, through the next month and year or two. So let's go to the next slide. There is no absolute magic. We all wish we had a crystal ball. And I think when we are in periods of uncertainty, that we can just say, throw up our hands and say, oh my God, there is just too much uncertainty. There's just no possible way I can figure out how to move forward. And what I'm here to say today is that there's always a way to move forward and to use some forms of rational decision making. And so I'm going back to an oldie but a goodie. That is an article that was in Harvard Business Review, published back in actually 1997, about how to make strategic decisions amidst tremendous uncertainty. And what I won't belabor is all the different levels of uncertainty, because the article steps through that, and I'm just going to cut to the chase. We, with this pandemic, are at a true level 4 of the highest level of uncertainty, and that means true ambiguity, that there is, quote unquote, no basis to forecast the future. Now, the characteristics of a crisis like this is, they don't last forever, and there are elements that start to emerge that can bring you back into being able to understand the range of uncertainty more at like a level 2 or potentially a level 3. And so when you think about in any organization is always having to make decisions amidst some amount of uncertainty. So the idea is just how much is there? And of course, right now we're in a tremendous amount. And yet, we are not on day 1 of the crisis. We are much further along. There is new information coming out every single day, and we do begin to have some basis from which we can make decisions. We may not be able to overly quantify it. There's a huge desire amongst business leaders to be able to have something a little more exact, and that's something that you have to make some peace with, that right now and for some foreseeable future, we are not going to have that kind of precise information. We will have directional information, and there are ways in which to obtain that so that you can start to make the decisions for moving forward. So how does one proceed when you're in this situation of true ambiguity and your typical models aren't necessarily going to work? Well, first of all, you need to, and this is number 2, identify, as you would in any scenario, the range of potential outcomes and their probabilities for happening. So to start at a very basic level with a business where you've got to just make sure that you can, first of all, survive, that you have, enough cash, liquidity to actually be able to conduct and continue your operations. You can look at some scenarios of your revenue picture. And very simply put, you can do a low, medium, and high. And perhaps low is being at 50% of what your normal revenue would be. Medium would be 85%, and high could potentially be over 100%, maybe 110%. And that's simplistic, but you can start to understand what your operational realities are and what your balance sheet is looking like. All of that, if you can bucket things into some simple potential scenarios and begin to assign the probabilities. Like, is there any probability of being at 110% of revenue? What would it take to be there? Or is that just completely out of the realm of possibility, given what you've had to shut down for the time being? Or is your shutdown, if you're an organization that's had to, postpone any elective treatments or surgeries, it's beginning to become apparent that we can start to reopen those lines of business. So how can you start to adjust for that and plan for some ratcheting back up, maybe not to full capacity, but being able to look at some of those scenarios. So we are seeing, again, with this coming out of the very initial stage of the crisis, there are some things that are starting to be relaxed a bit, loosened up, and that gives you some ability to say, okay, I may be in like a revenue trough right now, but within the next 3 months, I could be here. And is that a 50% or an 85% scenario? And what does that look like? And you can play those out and assign some probability for each of those happening and spend time on the areas that have a higher probability. You can be gathering information all the time, and there are already lots of surveys going out, early market indicators, even in other disciplines of what are consumers' comfort levels going to be to go back into a restaurant or to a waiting room in a physician's office. You can amass that kind of information that people are rapidly gathering and then make educated guesses about what that means for your situation. And so I talk about identifying patterns, look at analogous markets, even if you don't have your own information, and look back to some of the previous shocks and things that happened. While this, of course, is much bigger than many of those previous ones, there's still information you can glean from what happened after 9/11 or what happened in the Great Recession in 2008, or some other kind of maybe localized crisis, which happened after, being in a hurricane or devastating fires. There's certainly shocks that have happened regionally that you can look to for examples of what it took for consumers to feel comfortable coming back into a situation, the next normal, as it were. So another piece of guidance is to look at probable scenarios, but you don't have to look at every single possibility. It's just too much. And so we like to think about keeping things in a reasonable range, anywhere from 3, no more than 5 kinds of scenarios, or you'll drive yourself crazy. And again, we can't be overly quantitative. There's a huge qualitative aspect to this. And as I said, getting comfortable with that directional information, maybe not the precision. So all of these are techniques where you can be using a rational process in a time that, again, there is not all the information you want, but there is starting to be information that emerges. In the previous session, I talked about looking at what other countries are doing. We need to be very open to that because they are reopening, they're several weeks ahead of us, or months in the case of China. So what can we learn from what's happening there and bring into our context? Another thing to keep in mind is your strategic stance. And this is a whole huge topic in and of itself, but let me just say that organizations kind of take a position, whether they are going to think about being at the forefront where they want to shape the future. And in fact, in a time of level 4 uncertainty, a huge crisis like this is actually an extremely opportune time for those kinds of organizations that want to take some bigger risks, make the bigger bets, because in some sense, it's wide open. There are opportunities to move forward and try some things because people are going to be much more open to that than they might have been 2 months ago. So being a shaper of the future, being entrepreneurial, unleashing that creative spirit, the time is now for that. But there are those who are more risk averse and feel that that's where they need to play, and they are called adapters. And so they're going to take more of a hedge the bets approach, or even the third category, which is I'm going to wait and see. I'm going to make sure I stay viable, that I stay in business so that I'm still here, and I'm going to reserve the right to engage, but I'm not going to try to take a really big risk and shape the future. So, you have to decide with a lot of different factors with your senior leadership and your board what stance to take, but I just throw out there that in a level 4 situation, shaping the future is definitely an opportunity. And then you've just absolutely got to make a decision. You can't be in analysis paralysis, and holding back too much. You've got to keep moving forward. It's important for morale purposes for your organization, and you can't just let the events overtake you. So I'm a big fan of making decisions and then acting on them. That said, I'm going to move to the next slide, which is a repeat of the slide we showed last week, which is that when you're making decisions amidst all this uncertainty, you have to continually be iterating. And this is always true, but it's just more true now, and you've got to be able to iterate quickly. So it's the plan, do, study, act model. So all the things I said about using that framework that I was referencing in the previous slide, that's all part of planning. Then you go and do something, you carry it out, study it, review what happened, and then act on and decide what improvements to make and act on it. And, in 2 more weeks, there could be much better consumer information. We are the consumers. Check your own self. Like, where's your own comfort level? How is it to emerge into a world where we may be required to wear a mask? How does that change things? How quickly can we adapt to that? Looking at those kinds of things as opportunities, and also seeing that we're all emerging, as I say, into this next normal, and the data is coming, new data every day, and even from your own experience. So all of that is to say that it's not easy to make decisions amidst this kind of uncertainty, but at the same time, it's not impossible. And it actually does provide some opportunity to dream bigger and reimagine to get us ultimately to a better place. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Sarah, who I think wants to ask me a few questions. By the way, if you have any questions, please do type things into the chat.
Yep, absolutely. So we've been having some lagging videos, just so everyone's aware. We're all seeing it. So we're just going to continue through. The audio is absolutely fine. So if I look funny, I'm sorry. So thank you for giving us that rundown. I really appreciate both of those frameworks. I'd love to talk to you about a couple different things. One of them is, both of them are actually about the healthcare system specifically into the future. So we're all thinking about what's going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. But what we've seen over the last month and a half is a very rapid iteration and decision-making process happening in this, initial phase of the crisis, wherein we see things like, for example, the primary care system in our country that was planning to move to telehealth for, a subset of their population over the next 3 years, doing that in 2 weeks instead. And they were able to make that happen. We think of the healthcare system as this old sort of barge. You talk about turning the barge and how it's just near impossible. Well, this has forced it to really move fast. And So making decisions amidst uncertainty seems to be, it's certainly happening now, but what do you think is coming for the healthcare system over the next, 12 to 18 months? What do we expect to see more generally? And you could take that in a lot of different directions, but I'll let you pick one.
So I think the ability to pivot this rapidly is extremely encouraging, and to see the healthcare system able to do that all the way from the regulatory level down into the actual frontline operational level and through the payers in between. I got to experience that to some extent when we had the imperative to launch the Massachusetts Health Connector, and we were able to move more quickly than anyone had ever believed possible, with all the players that we had at the table, because there was this incredible focus and sense of purpose. And I think a crisis provides that. And so to sustain that, and certainly in healthcare where it's going to be hard, because if there's a reemergence of the virus, healthcare is on the most front lines of that, the healthcare system. And so we have to be prepared within healthcare to deal with a potential resurgence, more so than any of the other sectors, frankly, really have to, both from an employee perspective, from what we're providing as services, to our customer or the patient. All of our parties are affected, and so this idea of having to be able to have continuing rapid response and being flexible so that we can, learn from what we've been through just now and be able to reapply that, and yet try to have some normalcy of how we had our core business and day-to-day operations. But it's not going to be the old version of normal. So this ongoing need for flexibility to deal with this mysterious virus and what we still, don't know enough about, is going to require that level of leadership and comfort with uncertainty for the foreseeable future, and just more so in healthcare than elsewhere. And yet we've seen already in tremendous resilience and creativity. So that gives me hope that if we can just keep going with that kind of strength and sense of purpose and flexibility, we will get through this, and we can come out better on the other side.
Yeah, that's really great. I appreciate you talking about resiliency. We've been thinking about how to build a more resilient, flexible system more generally into the future. And we've been talking about sort of the 5 R's, from resolve all the way to reform. As we're moving into this reimagination and reform stage, because, right now we're sort of immersed in thinking about what does return look like. It's going to be complicated and messy and difficult. But, I think we're pushed through that period by being motivated by how can we reimagine things to be better? How can we be more resilient? What will reform look like? And that's what I'd love to hear about. What do you think reform-wise? Where are we going to go in the healthcare system?
Well, consumer expectations are going to change. I mean, the fact that the need for healthcare in such a dire situation has truly been shown to be universal. Doesn't matter what your individual circumstances, everyone needs it. So the idea that we as a society are going to expect more from the system and from our government, as we've seen the system and government step up during this time of crisis, I don't think the expectations are going to go completely back to where they were before. I think there will be some understanding, okay, this was a crisis, this was unique, and yet I don't think we'll ever go all the way back. So that means that there will be people expecting to have access to healthcare, both financially and ease of use. So where we've been able to be successful with telehealth, yes, and let's do more of that. And does that increase capacity? Does that make it, does that make the system more productive so that we can actually fit more visits in a day? It enhances the worker productivity too, because they're not losing time in transportation that they don't need to do. I mean, all of that, I don't think we're going back to how it was before. So we make those adjustments and we keep moving forward. Financially will be a big adjustment, because as more people lose their employer-sponsored coverage, and provider systems are based around that commercial payment rate, if people shift to the government programs, be that subsidized exchange program or Medicaid, the provider system is going to have to adjust to a lower revenue stream. So there may be a lot of volume, but less per patient, which forces, again, more of the kind of transformation that is underway. It's going to be expected to continue and at greater speed. Again, I have confidence that we can do it.
Awesome. I love that. So those are all the questions I had. We don't have any more in the chat right now. So why don't we move on to the final stage of our presentation today?
Sure. And we wanted to share a couple things with you. We have tried throughout this series to really emphasize that this crisis is a crisis both at personal and professional levels. And so it's incredibly important to be aware of how to think about your own mental health and those of the folks in your organization and amongst all of your clients. And so we want to continue to provide you with resources that we think are really good, that set the stage for what to be thinking about more systemically, and also how to actually, get some good tips of continuing to manage through this crisis as will be needed, certainly for the rest of this year. So here are a couple of ones that have come to our attention over the past week, and I want to encourage you to check out the article and also to participate in the Harvard School of Public Health weekly series, Wednesdays at 11, which is open to all. You do not have to have a Harvard affiliation, where they are tackling head-on how to handle mental health issues during this crisis. So we will keep updating resources on our page, and I'll hand it back to Sarah to talk about that.
Great. So we have a couple of... Oh, yeah, go back to the quote.
I do want to, before I say, so my last, my parting words are to bring it back to one of the most inspiring quotes I think we were able to bring forward, which is, as we think about reimagining, I look to somebody like Nelson Mandela, who was able to reimagine something that had seemed so impossible, and how to get beyond apartheid in South Africa. I think this quote is very inspiring. To Sarah.
We need this one daily. You can go to the next slide, Maria. So we have a couple of things that we just want to mention to you in closing on our final session here. The first is that we have launched just, I believe, yesterday or today, our COVID-19 resources page on our website. We encourage you to take a look at that. As Rosemarie mentioned, we try to pull in the professional and personal to make sure folks feel supported. So we've got lots of great resources that we find, noteworthy enough to look at. So please go check those out there. In addition, we know that the healthcare system is really in it right now, and over the next 18 months, we'll continue to need to adapt and change to sort of grapple with what we're going to be seeing coming, through next waves of virus, but also just thinking about how do we make ends meet, how are states thinking about, using their funds to bolster their individual healthcare systems and make sure that people still have the access that they need, and so we're really, I think, excited. So the motivating part is that we're excited to help with, the next phases that our healthcare system are about to go through, from operations to strategy to reform. And so with that, we'll close for our final sixth session. And we thank you so much for joining all the way through. And we'll be back with more information as we get it, and we'll put it on our resources page. And we also have an informational flyer that we can send out by email, and we'll blast around on social media. So be looking for that.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. We appreciate your time and attention. We hope we've been helpful. And again, feel free to contact us if you have any questions or things you'd like to have addressed. We are always available. So good luck, stay healthy, stay strong, and let's imagine a better future.
Agreed. Thanks.